and I have told you guys to explore about the bind function. Okay, let me explain you how bind works. So basically, using bind function also, we can change the reference of our this keyword. Using bind function, we can change the reference of our this keyword. Okay, so how to call the syntax? The syntax is very simple. Syntax for this bind will be your function name, whatever your function name you will have, that function name. Okay, dot bind function. You have to call the bind function. Now inside this function, if you are using this keyword, then that this keyword should point to which object. That object you have to pass as the first argument to this bind. So here object name. Okay, now what this bind function is going to do? This bind function will return the same function by changing the reference of this keyword. What bind function will do? It will change the reference of this keyword, whatever you are using in this function, and it will return you the same function. If it is returning in this, if it is returning something, you have to catch in one variable. So I'm just catching that same function in the same variable with, variable name and function name is. So you can take any variable, whatever you want, but in this variable, same function will be stored. But the reference of that this has been changed. Whatever this you are using inside this function, it is pointing to this object. It is pointing to this object. And if you want, now you can call this function in the next line something like this, fn name, by passing number of arguments that function is expecting. The only difference between call, apply, bind is bind will return the same function by changing the reference of this keyword. Call and apply will not return any functions. This is the difference. Now, if I go back to my VS Code, if I just create here bind.js, and let's assume that I have object1 equals to some property, and I have one more object, something like C with some other value. So I have two objects. Now let's assume that we are creating a function fn add. Now this function is expecting two parameters x comma y, and let's assume that I'm simply doing console.log of x plus y plus this dot c. Now if I call this function add, in this case this will point to your window object. In that case, it will return undefined. This entire thing will return undefined. Undefined plus whatever you will add. At the end, it will return you the value with not a number. Suppose here I am passing 10, 10. So what it will do, 10 plus undefined. So whenever you add any value to undefined, it will return not a number. So if I just go and execute this, node bind. Now see, it is returning not a number. Now why not a number it is referring? Because why it is returning not a number? Because it is returning undefined. Now why it is returning undefined? Because this is referring to window object, and in our window object we don't have any property like a C. So in that case, what it will do, whenever you say this dot C, it means internally you are saying like window dot C. Now first it will check in this window object C property is there or not. If it is not there, it will add, this line will add one C property in that window object, and it will assign the value undefined, and it will return that value undefined. That is the reason 10 plus undefined will return not a number. Now we want this should not refer to window. We want this should refer to object1 or object2 depending upon our requirement. So in that case, what I will do, simply I will call this fn add dot bind. Now inside this fn add we are using this should refer to which object? That object you have to pass as a first argument. Suppose I am saying object1. Okay, now what this entire thing will do, this will return same function. It will return same function, but by changing the reference of that this keyword. Now you can catch in one variable. Suppose I am catching in one variable called x. Now what you have inside this x, this function is stored. But inside this function, whatever this is there, that this is pointing to this object. Now simply you can call this x like a function and you can pass the arguments 10, 10. Now here, what will be the result? 10 plus 10, 20, 20 plus 100. So result should be 120. Now if I go back and re-execute it, we got 120. We got 120. Okay, this is one way how we can use this bind function. One more way is like here x, again calling x like a function, we might get confused. Now people might feel that x is some different function. So what we prefer to take variable name as same as function name. Whatever your function name is there, same name we will prefer to take the variable name, so that you will not have any kind of confusion here. Now still if you re-execute it, you will get the same result. You got still 120 only. Okay, it is just recommended that take your variable name also the same name as a function. But if you take some other name of your variable, still it works. This is one way how we can call. Or else we can call like this also. We can call fn add dot bind. We can pass our object, like for example, I'm passing object to, and our function argument we can pass here itself. If you want here itself you can pass. Suppose I'm passing 50, 50. Now what it will do? It will return the function. So just catch in one variable. Now you are passing the argument to this bind function. So now whenever you are calling fn add, now here no need to pass that arguments. No need to pass the arguments. Directly if you execute, it will execute here. Here we have 200. So let's see why 200 you are getting here. Here it should be 300, right? Here object 2. Let me re-execute it. Fn add dot bind. Okay, here we have the same variable name, right? That might be the problem. So let me take different variable name. Okay, here we have same variable name, or else we will do one thing. We will comment this part. Okay, now we will re-execute. Now we got 400. Now here we got 400. So 50 plus 50, 100, 100 plus 300. So it's like 400. So here we have taken same variable name, right? That is the reason that was giving issue. So I have just commented previous code and re-executing it. This is one more way how we can use bind. One more way we can use something like this also. So let me just comment this part. Fn add dot bind. You can just pass your object, whatever object you want to pass. And you can pass here argument, whatever argument you want to pass. Suppose I'm passing 5, 5. Now this entire thing will return one function, right? Now instead of catching that in one variable, what we can do? We can just write here one more parenthesis. Now what is the meaning of this? This entire line from here to here, it will return one function. From here to here, it will return one function. Whatever function it is returning, we are calling that function. We are calling that function. So it means it is calling the returned function. Whatever this entire thing is returning, that function we are calling. So you will get same result now. Now if I just execute it, now here I got 310. So this is one more way how we can call the returned function. This is one more syntax to call the returned function. Only returned function will work in this way. Or else you can do one more way. Now I can say fn add dot bind. I can pass my object here. Then I can call my return function. And here I can pass my number of arguments. So now here I am using object 1. So 10 plus 10, 20, 20 plus 100, 120. So we should get 120 in the output. We got 120. So like this bind you can use in 4 different ways. These are the 4 different ways in which we can use the bind function. So you can use something like this, you can use something like this, you can use something like this, or you can use something like this. However you want, you can use. But you have to remember only one thing: bind will return the function, call and apply will not return the function. Apply will take only 2 arguments. The first argument is object, second argument is always array. Call will take, like in call, we cannot guess how many arguments it will take. So in call also, first argument will be object. From second argument, it depends upon how many arguments the function is expecting. If your function is expecting 10 arguments, then call will take 11 arguments. Okay. So the purpose of, so in your interviews, they will ask, what is call, apply, bind? Okay. It's very famous interview question. In lot of interviews, they will ask, what is call, apply, bind? So you have to simply say call, apply, bind are 3 predefined functions. Okay, then they will ask what is the purpose of this predefined functions. The purpose of these 3 predefined functions is to change the reference of this keyword inside our function. The purpose of all these 3 predefined function is to change the reference of this keyword. Then they will ask why we have to change the reference of this keyword. Then you have to say by default, this is referring to window object. Now, sometimes I might get a requirement where I want my this should refer to some other object. In that case, this call apply bind will help me to change the reference of this keyword in my function dynamically. So dynamically, if you want to change on runtime, if you want to change the reference of this keyword, then you can go with call apply bind. Then they will ask if all these 3 are using for same purpose, then what is the difference between them? Then you have to say the difference is number of arguments. The difference is the only number of arguments. Apply will take only 2 arguments. Call, we cannot guess how many arguments it takes because it depends upon function. And bind is something here also we cannot guess, but bind will always return one function. Call and apply will not return the function. So this is the differences that you can explain whenever they are asking about call, apply, bind. Okay, so internally in object-oriented programming, this call, apply, bind will be used internally by JavaScript. How they will be used, you will come to know once I start explaining you about the object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Remember, we don't use much object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Very rarely we will use. There are a lot of concepts which are not supported in JavaScript. Your overloading is not supported in JavaScript. Okay, your interface concept is not supported in your JavaScript. Abstract classes, abstract methods, abstract concept is not supported in JavaScript. So all these features are not supported in your JavaScript. So JavaScript supports partially object-oriented programming, and we won't use much. Like 99% we never use object-oriented programming in JavaScript. JavaScript is all about functional programming. It means in our JavaScript, we just create functions. So in 2015, object-oriented programming was introduced in JavaScript. Before that, there was no object-oriented programming in JavaScript. So you have so many things to learn about object-oriented programming if you are exploring the programming languages like Java or C#. There you will spend almost 1 month or something like that. In JavaScript, we will spend nearly 1 or 2 hours, not more than that. Because we never use it, we don't have much concepts also. And concept is same. Whatever inheritance you have learned, same inheritance you have in the JavaScript. Whatever class concept you have learned in Java, same concept we have in the JavaScript also. Just little bit syntax will change. Okay, this is about call, apply, bind. Next, we have to understand about scope. Scopes in JavaScript. Now, what is the meaning of scope? Anybody knows what is the meaning of scope in general English? What is the meaning of scope? Anybody? So basically, scope refers to the accessibility. Scope refers to the accessibility. Okay, if I say you, this is the scope of variable. If I say something like this is the scope of variable, it means till that extent only you can access that variable. Till that extent only you can access that variable. Basically, scope refers to the accessibility. For example, we are Indians, right? We cannot cross the borders of our India without permission. Without your permission, you cannot cross your India, right? So if you want to cross India, you require the permissions. It means our scope is within the India. Within the India, we can go anywhere without any permission. But if you want to go out of India, for example, you want to go to US, then you require permission, you require passport, right? You require visa. So our scope is India, like we can roam anywhere in the India. Okay, so scope refers to the accessibility. In the same way, there is something called scope in JavaScript. There are totally 3 scopes in JavaScript. There are 3 scopes in JavaScript. The first scope we call as a global scope. Then we have something called function scope. Then we have something called module scope. Module scope. So these are the 3 different scopes given by JavaScript. Now this scopes concept we can use for our functions and variables. This scopes concept we can use for our functions and variables. It means we can decide like what is the accessibility of function, till what extent you can access your function, at what extent you can access your variables. So that is what defined using this scopes concept. So scopes concept defines the accessibility of your functions and variables. So in JavaScript, we have totally 3 scopes: global scope, function scope, module scope. And one more general word people will use, something called block scope. Block scope. Now blocks is very general term which we can use for global scope also, for function scope also, for module scope also. Block scope is nothing but block means in your JavaScript anything which starts in between these curly braces, open curly braces, close curly braces. So this is called one block in JavaScript. So we can use function block scope, we can say module block scope, we can say global block scope. Block scope is just a general term which we can use for any scope to determine. But in JavaScript, we have only 3 scopes, that is global scope, function scope, module scope. Global scope refers to the JavaScript file. Suppose you created one JavaScript file. Now inside this file, this entire thing is called global. This entire thing within the file is called global scope. If you define any variable inside your JavaScript file, or if you define any variable in global scope, then you can access that variable anywhere in the global scope. If you define any variable in the global scope, then you can access that variable anywhere in the global scope. If you define any function in the global scope, then you can access that function anywhere in the global scope. Global scope refers to your entire JavaScript file. Now here I have created one JavaScript file. This entire thing is called global scope. Suppose if I am directly defining here a variable where something like city equals to Delhi. Now I have defined this variable in the global scope. Now this variable I can access anywhere inside this JavaScript file. Suppose if I am creating here multiple functions, function f1 or function f2 or function f3. Now this variable you can access inside this function also, inside this function also, inside this function also. Suppose directly if I say here console.log of ct. Now this variable I can define, I can access anywhere inside this function. Not only inside this function, anywhere you can access. I can access here also. Now if I just call all this function f1, f2, f3. Now here if I execute this node global scope. Now see, it is printing Delhi, 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 Delhi. So anything that you define on the top of your files, if you are not defining inside any curly braces, that is called global scope. If you are not defining something inside any curly braces, then those are called global scope. Now here this entire function is in global scope. This entire function is in global scope. This entire function is in the global scope. Suppose if I define one function inside f1. Now this is the function which is defined inside one curly brace. In this case, f1, fn inside, in this case, fn is not in the global scope. Fn is not in the global scope. Apart from fn, everything is in the global scope. So this variable we did not define. We did not define inside any curly braces. So it is in the global scope. This entire function, f1 function, we did not define inside any curly braces. So it is also a global scope. This is also a global scope. This is also a global scope. So if any function or variable is in a global scope, then that function and variable you can access anywhere inside the file. Only anywhere inside the file you can access. If I want inside f3, I can access my f2. Inside f2, I can access my f1. I can access my f1. So now here if I execute, I won't get any error. I won't get any error. I will get the result. So a simple way to find out what is the global scope means, if a variable and functions are not defined inside any block, then those variables and functions are said to be in the global scope. Okay, if any functions or variables or class not defined inside the block, okay, we will use the term block. Block means open curly brace, close curly brace. Then they are said to be in global scope. Now next we have something called function scope. Function scope means anything if you define inside the function, those are called function scope. Suppose if I say f1 and inside this if I create variable something like gender equals to male. Now in this case if I ask what is the scope of this variable, now this scope is defined inside one curly brace, and that curly brace or that block belongs to one function. So this variable is called function scope. This variable is called function scope. Now here if I define one more function, now this function is also called, it has a function scope. It means this function you can use only inside this block only. Outside the block you cannot use. Suppose here if I do console.log of fn is called. Now this variable and this function are in the function scope. Now this variable and this function you cannot use outside this block. You cannot use outside this block. Suppose here I want to do console.log of gender. I cannot access this gender now. This gender I cannot access this outside this curly brace now. Now here if I just try to execute node function scope. Now see, it is giving me one reference error. gender is not defined. It is saying that gender is not defined. But already we defined gender, right? But it is giving me gender is not defined. Why? Because we are trying to access that variable outside our function scope. That is why it is giving us error. But this console.log, if I try to execute anywhere, maybe inside this function or maybe inside, maybe here, if I'm trying to access here or here, I can access it. Because now this variable you can access within this curly braces anywhere. Okay, now here I need to call that F1 function, right, to execute. Now if I go back here, clear all this. Now I got here main. I got here main. We got this main. Now this console is not executed because we did not call this function. Now this fn function you cannot call here. I cannot call fn function here. I cannot call my fn function here. If I just try to call, it will give me the error. Now here I am getting reference error. Fn is not defined. I am getting here reference error. Okay, so anything which is defined inside this function scope, those things you can access only inside those function scope. Outside the function you cannot access. You cannot access. This is the function scope. Module scope already we have discussed. Module scope is nothing but it is a scope where a functions can accessible, a functions or variable can be accessible in another file. If you define a function or variable in one file, those functions and variables you can access in another file. Those are called module scope. So if you prefix with export keyword in front of any function or variable, then those functions and variables are called module scope. Those are called module scope. Any function or variable, if you prefix with the export keyword, those are called module scope. Any functions or variables, if you define inside the function block, those are called function scope. Any functions and variables which you did not define inside any curly braces, you did not define inside any block, those are called global scope. Those are called global scope. Now in your interviews, they will ask, what is global scope? What is function scope? What is module scope? Or they can ask, can you explain me what are the like how many scopes we have in JavaScript? So we have 3 scopes. Can you list out those scopes? Then you have to say global scope, function scope, module scope. Then they will ask you, can you explain me global scope? When I can say a function or variable is in the global scope. Can you explain me module scope? Can you explain me function scope? This kind of questions can come in your interviews. Is it clear, guys? What is global scope, function scope? And anyways, we have seen in the last session module scope also. Now, tell me, suppose here I am creating function f1 console.log of something like maybe I will add here something like salary, var salary equals to some value. Now if I ask you what is the scope of this variable, what will be your answer? What is the scope of salary variable? Yes, it is a global scope because we did not define inside any block. So it is a global scope. What is the scope of F1? What is the scope of F1? Yes, it is also a global scope. What is the scope of this gender variable? What is the scope of this gender variable? Yes, it is a function scope because it is defined under some function. Okay. Now with this scope, your scope statements came into picture. There are three scope statements: var, let, const. Var, let, const are the three scope statements. They are going to define the scope of your variables. Var, let, and const will define the scope of your variables. If you define any variable with var, by default, they are function scope. They are function scope. If you define any variable with var inside the function, then they are called function scope. Let and const are called block scope. They are called block scope. They are called block scope. Okay, if var is called function scope, let and const are called block scope if they are not defined, in the global scope. If they are not defined in the global scope. Okay, this is the condition applied. If they are not defined in the global scope, and if they are defined under certain function, then var, any variable created with var is called function scope. Any variable created with let and const are called block scope. Now, what is the meaning of that? Let's try to understand. Now here I am saying something like scope statement. Suppose if I am creating one function here, function something called f1. Now for this function, this is the block. Block started here, block is ending here. Now inside this, let's assume that I am creating a variable var name equals to something like AIT, Ashok IT. Now this variable is created using var scope statement. It means by default, this variable is a function scope now. Now this variable you can access anywhere inside the function, Suppose here I have multiple blocks. Suppose here I am just writing true, console.log of name. Suppose I have one more block. If here also I am just writing true, here also I am doing console.log of name. Now here inside this function we have multiple blocks. This is the first block. This is another block. This is another block. Now if you define any variable with var inside your function, then by default they are called function scope. You can define any variable inside your function with var. Suppose here I am declaring one variable var city equals to Delhi. Now this variable is also called function scope only. It means this variable you can access anywhere inside the function. Suppose here I want to access console.log of city. I can access this variable here also. Nothing but outside this block also I can access. Now if I just try to execute it, I got here result. As it is, I got the result. It means this variable I defined on the top of my function but I can access inside my if blocks. Now this variable I defined inside my if block, but I am able to access outside my if block also. But if you define your variable with let, this is let. Now here you will get the issue. Now let are block scope. They are block scope. It means for this variable, this is the block. It started here, it ended here. Now this variable you can use anywhere, you can access anywhere inside this block. Now CT, this is also a variable. Now this variable you defined with let, it means this variable is also block scope. So for this variable, the block is this one. It started here, it ended here. Now this variable you can access only inside this block. You cannot access outside this block. Now see, if I'm trying to access this CT outside this block, here I'm trying to access, it will throw me the error. It will throw me the error. If I just try to execute it, it will give me the error. It is saying that CT is not defined. It is saying that CT is not defined. So your lets, any variable which you created using let or const, they are block scope. It means if you define them in certain block, then they can be accessed only in that block. They can be accessed only in that block. If you define any variable in the global scope, if you define any variable in the global scope, it means for this variable, this entire file is like a block. This entire file is like a block. So these variables you can access anywhere. Whether you are defining with var or let, that doesn't matter. If you define in the global scope, you can access anywhere inside the file. But let is something, if you define in certain block, then you can access only in that block, only in that block. You cannot access outside that block. This is the first difference between var, let, and const. Var is a function scope, let and const are the block scope. They are the block scope. They are the block scope. Second difference, var, let, and const. Second difference, in var, whenever hoisting is done, whenever hoisting is performed, your JavaScript will assign undefined value. So var variables will be assigned with undefined value after hoisting. Let and const. Let and const. If you define any variable with let or const, so after hoisting, these variables will not be assigned. These variables will not be assigned with undefined value after hoisting. So whenever hoisting is done, in that case, any variable which you will declare with var, so all those var variable will be assigned with undefined value. But this let and const are not assigned with undefined value. So if you try to access this let or const before its declaration, it will give you one error. It will give you one error. What is that error? You cannot access variable before its initialization. You will get an error. You cannot access your variables before its initialization. So let's check here. Suppose I have here console.log of, if I say here gender, I declare here var gender equals to male. Now in this case, it will not give me any error. In my console, it will print undefined. It will print undefined. But if I declare any variable with let, if I declare variable with let, in that case, it will give me the error, cannot access gender before initialization. Cannot access gender before initialization. So basically what happens, this variable will not be assigned with undefined value. That is the reason we get this message. Cannot access gender before initialization. Same with the const also. If I use const, I will get the same error. Cannot access gender before initialization. Same error I will get. So this error why we are getting? Because after hoisting, these variables will not be assigned with undefined value. They will not be assigned with undefined value by your JavaScript engine. That is the only reason. That is the only reason why you will get that error message. So this is the second difference between your var, let, and const. So if you define any variable with var, let, or const in global scope, they are called global scope only. Shravan, you can watch last recording. You will understand what is hoisting. Third difference. With var, variable declaration and initialization, both are possible. With var, variable declaration and initialization, both are possible. Variable declaration and initialization, both are possible. With let also, declaration and initialization, both are possible. But with const, only initialization is possible. Declaration is not possible. Variable declaration you cannot do with const. It means something like this. Okay, let's suppose I have a variable called gender. I can declare it. This is called declaration. I have a variable var city equals to Delhi. This is called initialization. So declaration is possible, initialization is possible with var. If you go with let name, declaration is possible. If you say let maybe something like salary equals to some value, initialization is also possible. Here also declaration, initialization is possible. Here also it is possible. But if I go with const, if I say const id, now here declaration is not possible. If I say const something like pin, now initialization is possible, but declaration is not possible. So you cannot do declaration. You cannot do variable declaration with the const. You can do variable declaration with var and let, but you cannot do with const. You cannot do with const. You cannot do with const. But initialization is possible with all these three. This is one more, reassigning the value. Reassigning the value. Reassigning the value is possible with var and let. With var and let, you can reassign your variables with the new value. But here reassigning is not possible. Reassigning the value is not possible. What is the meaning of that? Here you created a variable, you have assigned some value. If you want, you can reassign the value with new data. It will work. Here also it will work. But here you cannot reassign. Suppose if I say pin equals to some other number, it's not possible. Here if I just try to run, it will give me the error. Now I'm just commenting this line, and if I just try to access here console.log of pin, it will give me the error. So node, if I say task1, now it is giving me the error. So assignment to a const variable, it is saying type error. It is saying that you cannot reassign. You cannot reassign the value to the const variables. It will give us the error. So reassignment is not possible. This is your fourth difference. And fifth difference is if you go with let var const, with let and const, shadowing is not possible. Shadowing is not possible. With var, shadowing is possible. Here shadowing is possible. Here shadowing is possible. Shadowing is not possible. Here shadowing is possible. Shadowing means yesterday last session we have learned, right? Now if I create var ct equals to something, I can do again var ct and I can just add some other value. It means you can declare same variable 2 times. You can initialize same variables 2 times. But with let, it's not possible. Again, if I do let name, it will give me the error. So it is saying redeclare block scope variable. Cannot redeclare. You cannot redeclare the things. Same with the const also. You cannot redeclare. You cannot redeclare. Here you can redeclare. The technique of redeclaring your variables is called shadowing. The technique of redeclaring your variables is called shadowing in the JavaScript. So with let and const, shadowing is not possible. With var, shadowing is possible. This is the fifth difference. So like this, if someone asks you, what is the difference between let var const and this is Commonly asked interview question. A lot of time these questions will be asked. Difference between let, const and var. So this difference you can explain. So const is a variable which is more secured. After const, let is secured. After let, var is secured. So if you go security wise, const is more secured. Afterwards, let is secured, then var is secured. This you can mention as a sixth difference. Security wise, const variables are more secured because once you assign the value, you cannot change it. After const, let are more secured because they are block scope. Outside the block, you cannot use it. No one can access your variables outside your block. After that, var. Var is like function scope. If you define under certain function, you cannot access that variable outside the function. Okay. So you can watch the hoisting. I already explained in the last session. You can just watch that recording. You will come to know. So this is about your scope statements. Now, depending upon your requirement, you decide. Your variable should be declared with let, var, const. That totally depends upon requirement. If you think that you want to store some data in certain variable where the value of that variable should not get changed, you want to fix that value inside that variable. In that case, you go with const. If you think that under certain block, you want to store some data and that data should not get accessible outside that block, in that case, you store that data using let. In another scenarios, remaining scenarios, you can go with var. So now that completely depends upon requirement, which scope statement you have to use to create variables. All are best based on the requirement, based on the requirement. So you cannot say const is best than let or let is best than var. We have three techniques. Now, depending upon our requirement, whichever techniques more suitable to our requirement, use that technique. Maybe I am developing the project for me, var might be more suitable. So I will use var. You are developing the project, for you, let might be more suitable. You will use let. Again, in project scenario to scenario, requirement to requirement, things will change. So in lot of interviews, they will ask, like, which is the best way to declare variable, let, var, or const? So don't say the answer let, const, or var. You have to say the answer depends upon my requirement. Nothing is best, nothing is waste. Okay. So depending upon your requirement, you have to choose. As a developer, you have to choose which scope statement you have to use to declare a variable. Now, if you are like, if you get a fever, then there are multiple tablets, right? There is a paracetamol, right? There is something like a kerosene, like this. There are so many tablets. Now, depending upon your fever symptoms, doctor will decide, right, which tablet has to assign to you. Now, they don't assign same tablets to each and every patient. They will first analyze the patient, right? What extent fever he has, right? What are different symptoms he has? According to that, they will suggest the tablets. Here also same thing. We won't use the same scope statements for each and every project. Depending upon your requirement, we will use it. So now why I'm explaining this? Because in interviews, they will ask which is the best way to declare or initialize your variables. So in that case, you have to give that answer. Okay. So tomorrow I will take little long session, guys, because tomorrow I want to cover 4 topics: class, constructor, promise, and fetch. At any cost, I need to cover all these topics. So tomorrow will be little long session. So I will start the session tomorrow by like 5:35 max to max. Okay, so make sure you guys are joining before 5:35. Now, why I am saying, because if you lose any one concept, then understanding entire session will be very challenging for you. Suppose I am explaining class, but you join little late and you missed the explanation of class. You won't understand constructor. If you did not understand constructor, you don't understand promise. If you won't understand promise, you won't understand fetch also. So that is the reason I am saying that try to join before 5:30 only. Just try to join before 5 minutes. Okay, so these are the topics which I will cover in tomorrow's session, and very important topics. And if time permits, I will explain you about the callback hell. We know what are callbacks, but there is a concept called callback hell. What is that callback hell? I will explain. Okay, or else we will see this topic in the day after tomorrow session. And from 11th September, we are starting with React. Okay, at 8 p.m. At 8 p.m. we are starting with React.js. Anyways, I think you guys got the information. But from my end, I'm just saying that from 11th September, we are starting with React.js at 8 p.m. Okay, session will be from 8 to 9 p.m. I don't prefer taking React.js more than 1 hour, or max to max 1 hour 15 minutes. If I take more than that, everything will go out of your head. So the technologies like Angular, React, I prefer, like that's my personal opinion, that people should focus 1 hour or 1 hour 15 minutes, and remaining thing they have to spend in the practice. Yeah, that's all guys from my end. So remaining things we will see in tomorrow's session.